In this video, we're going to be talking about the phases of gait, what they are, the biomechanics behind each one, and why I put so much value and emphasis into understanding it and use it for programming. So in the first phase of gait, this is the heel strike phase. And so what I consider the heel strike is essentially when the heel hits the ground all the way to when the first met head, which is this bone here, the base or the ball of the big toe, makes contact with the ground. When this happens, the shin is actually behind the ankle. Our pelvis is also behind the ankle. So think like our center of gravity shifted back. So our body's totally unweighted. We have all the range of motion available to us because our body hasn't moved through the different ranges of motion and hasn't progressed the center of gravity forward. So when our heel hits the ground, we are going to land on the outside part of our heel. So this is called inversion of the heel. So when I land on the outside of the heel, the ground is going to push my heel inwards. And when the heel gets pressed inwards like that, the arch is going to lift up, and that's going to cause my first met head to make contact with the ground. So my heel is going to hit the ground, and then my first met head is going to hit the ground. You can see the arch is going to lift up in this case. The shin, because it's behind the ankle, is going to open up the space in the front of the ankle, which is very important for the later phases of gait, for when my shin actually has to travel forward. So this heel strike is going to promote more of this external rotation because it's creating this supinated foot, at the shin, at the knee, and all the way up to the hip. So from the pelvis standpoint, when that heel hits the ground and the first met head makes contact, again, what's going to happen is the pelvis is going to turn towards that side. As soon as I strike the ground with my foot, my whole body is going to turn towards that direction. So the sacrum, which is this bone here, is going to turn towards the right. Let's say the right side's making that heel strike. That is then going to cause an external rotation of the femur, and it's going to allow for more hip flexion just because the sacrum is turning towards that side. The pelvis is going to rotate towards the side of more hip flexion. So for the second phase of gait, this is called midstance. Now, midstance is the longest part of gait. If you look at any type of anatomy textbook or any type of research, it is the longest duration, and that is why I actually divide midstance into two different parts, an earlier phase of the midstance and the later phase of midstance. And that is just because there's two different things that happen, but we're not going to get into that third or that second phase of midstance. But if you want this fourth phase of gait breakdown, comment below and we'll cover it in another video. So during this midstance, as I said, I hit the ground with the heel, the first met head hits the ground. Now the shin and the body starts to move forward over top of the foot. Now when this tibia starts to translate forward, that is going to create more of this ankle flexion, also called dorsiflexion, which is then going to start to flatten the arch into the ground. So instead of having this really high arch or a higher arch and this supinated arch like we did in heel strike, this arch is actually starting to flatten as the ankle starts to move through or move forward. That is called pronation. Supination is when the arch goes up. Pronation is when that arch turns in and goes down, also called internal rotation of the foot. So during this midstance, we are going to start to create more internal rotation at the foot because the arch is flattening, at the shin, which is really important for knee flexion because the tibia and the knee are translating forward, and internal rotation at the hip, which is very important for force production as well as some aspect of force absorption. So if we start at heel strike on the right side, we move towards midstance. Now what starts to happen is when I move into midstance, this pelvis actually starts to translate forward and go forward. And so now the sacrum was facing towards the right during that right heel strike. Now it's starting to move forward, so it's facing straight ahead. And that is going to cause more of this nutation of the sacrum, which essentially just means that the space between or from the sacrum to the sit bone actually moves further apart and gets bigger. And so when this happens, this creates more of this internal rotation of the pelvis and of the hip, which again is very important for force production, force absorption, as well as hinging exercises. So the third phase of gait is this toe off phase, and this is the last phase of gait. This is when the heel actually starts to lift off the ground. So I strike the heel and heel strike, then the shin starts to move forward. I'm gonna hit a point where I can't flex my ankle anymore. So I've maxed out on the room in the front of the ankle. And when that happens, my heel then begins to start to lift off the ground. And so I start to go into this big toe extension. So think of like a top of a calf raise. That starts to happen when my hip becomes more extended. So in this phase of gait, we now have a lot of force production happening. Think of somebody who's doing like a triple extension jump, somebody who's about to jump off. You take a snap photo or a snapshot of their jump, you'll start to see their heel lift up. Again, like a calf raise is a great example. But in this last phase, this is when we start to promote a lot more stiffness and force production. So at the hip, at the knee, and at the ankle, we create a lot of stiffness to allow the motion to happen just at this big toe. So we start to move around this big toe, and that's going to turn our body towards the other side. This is going to teach us how to propel out of this side. So in this last phase, we talked about how mid-stance is the sacrum facing forward. Now what's going to happen, and if the right side's moving the toe off, is the sacrum actually starts turning away from that side. So what happens is this pelvis, this right pelvis, starts to move forward, and the sacrum turns away from that side. And that is going to be our hip extension. That is going to be when the heel starts to break off the ground so that my left side can prepare for heel strike. So why is all this important? So me personally, I've used Gait and this model of Gait, the understanding of the mechanics, as a way to use as part of my assessment process as well as my programming. So what I'll do is I'll break up my assessment process into different phases of gait to understand where somebody is, which phase of gait they're stuck in, or what phase of gait they don't have access to. And so I'm using these assessment measurements to determine what they do and do not have from a mobility standpoint, and even from a performance standpoint, because each phase of gait can be related to different aspects of force production or force absorption. And so what I can then do is take those assessment measurements and give them exercises based on this model of gait to improve their range of motion and give them what they don't have. If this sounds interesting to you, if you want to learn a lot more about these kind of concepts, check out our Foundations of Biomechanics course. Check the link below. And like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video where we actually break down different exercises according to those phases of gait.